It was an ordinary night, nothing extraordinary in the air. The kind of night that feels comforting, as if time itself has slowed down, letting the world outside settle into silence. Lucas was in his downtown apartment, lounging on the couch after a long, hectic day at work. The soft glow of a table lamp lit up the room, casting shadows that danced across the walls while he scrolled through social media on his phone. The only sounds breaking the quiet were the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional whoosh of cars driving by outside. He lived in a modest apartment on the 6th floor, a safe and peaceful place, removed from the frantic buzz of the city below. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that night. Then his phone buzzed, and the screen lit up with a cold, bluish glow. He wasn't expecting any important messages, but as he glanced at the notification, the smile on his face slowly faded. On the screen was a citywide emergency alert, something he'd never seen before. Emergency alert: stay away from windows. Do not look outside. Lucas frowned and leaned back into the couch. It wasn't storm season, and there hadn't been any news about major natural disasters. So, why would he get such a vague warning? Emergency messages usually detailed things like weather hazards, traffic accidents, or some event demanding immediate attention. But this one felt different. He scrolled down, searching for more details, but there was nothing else. No explanation, no context, just that brief, direct instruction. What was he supposed to do? Ignore it? Or take it seriously? He chuckled to himself, trying to shake off the uneasiness creeping into his chest. It's probably a mistake, he thought. Some kind of glitch in the system. Still, the message lingered in his mind. It was as if the words were echoing in his ears, repeating themselves silently, and he couldn't stop thinking about what they could possibly mean. Don't look outside? Why? What could be out there that he wasn't supposed to see? Before he could decide what to do, a growing sense of unease crept over him. He glanced at the window. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the darkness of the night, with streetlights flickering faintly in the distance. Yet there was something in the air, something he couldn't quite define, that started to gnaw at the edges of his thoughts. Don't look outside. Suddenly he heard it, a faint tap against the window. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to catch his attention. For a moment he froze. It wasn't the wind. Lucas couldn't see what was outside. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But then his phone buzzed again, cutting through his spiraling thoughts. He looked down at the screen, where the same message still sat, pulsing, waiting to be acknowledged. Do not look outside. It was as if the message demanded his focus. And curiosity, like an invisible force, began to take hold of him. Now, Lucas didn't know which urge was stronger, the instinct to ignore the message or the gnawing sense that something was lurking outside, waiting to be seen. The silence seemed to grow heavier, almost oppressive. Every second that passed, the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch further, creeping closer to him, as if they were watching, waiting. He hesitated, staring at the window, his mind racing with the possibility that something, or someone, was out there, waiting for him to notice. Curiosity, that treacherous force, grew stronger in his chest. What could be so dangerous or so mysterious about what he wasn't supposed to see? The message, vague and unexplained, only became more unsettling with each passing moment. Lucas couldn't shake the thought. He knew he should ignore the alert. It was just an emergency message, probably a system glitch. He needed to be rational, but a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if it's real? What if you don't look now and something happens? What could be so serious?" He didn't understand why he felt so tense, but something deep inside him seemed to scream for action, for him to look, to uncover the truth. Slowly, Lucas rose from the couch, every movement feeling heavier, burdened with a strange inevitability. His footsteps echoed unnervingly loud in the empty room as he made his way to the window, unease building with every step until he finally stopped before the glass. The city outside was eerily quiet. The glow from the streetlights was the only thing piercing the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows onto the sidewalks. But something felt off. The absence of any noise, save for the faint whistle of the wind, was unnervingly profound, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Lucas ran his hand along the cold glass, staring at his own reflection. But beyond the faint outline of his face, something in the darkness caught his attention. He couldn't make it out, but it felt as if something was there, shifting just outside the reach of the light. Taking a deep breath, he pulled back the curtain. The wind rattled the glass, but everything seemed normal. The streets were empty, as they always were at this hour. The sky, void of clouds or stars, stretched above like an infinite black abyss. But in the corner of the window, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, he saw something, a shadow. It wasn't human. It wasn't even natural. It was something else, something distorted. Before he could fully process what he was seeing, the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't just a soft tap on the glass. It was as if something was scratching against the window, dragging something sharp along its surface. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the noise grew louder, more relentless, a high-pitched screech that seemed to claw at his very thoughts. He stumbled back from the window, his body tense, as though an invisible force was pulling him away. Yet his eyes couldn't look away. Something compelled him to keep watching, something he couldn't explain. And that's when he saw it. A figure, or what resembled a figure, was there, in the shadows. It wasn't human, not completely. The darkness formed a humanoid shape, but it was grotesquely warped, with unnaturally long limbs that bent and twisted in ways that defied logic. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, glowed like twin beacons in the void. They weren't eyes at all, but piercing points of light, fixed and mesmerizing. Lucas was frozen, his breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to back away, to look away, to do exactly what the message had warned, but his feet felt glued to the floor. He couldn't tear his eyes away, and his thoughts started spiraling into a panic he couldn't control. The scratching noise continued, now accompanied by a low murmur, almost like it was trying to talk to him, but the words made no sense. It was distorted, like the thing was speaking in a language Lucas couldn't comprehend. And then a clear, chilling phrase formed, coming not from the creature's mouth, but straight into his mind. "You looked. Now you can't escape." Terror gripped Lucas. He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet as he desperately tried to get away from the window. But those eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes, wouldn't let him go. They were fixed on him, like they could see straight into the deepest corners of his soul. That's when he heard it, a different sound, one that sent his heart racing faster than ever, a window slowly sliding open. It sounded deliberate, as if someone or something outside was making its way in. He couldn't move. His mind was frozen, locked in place. The creature, or whatever it was, already knew he had seen it. And just as the message warned, he was trapped now. The window was opening, and Lucas knew time had run out. The dragging sound of the window sliding open was slow and torturous, like a muffled scream, a harbinger of something unnatural breaking through the barrier between his world and the thing he feared most. He tried to move, to run, to pull himself away from the window, but his body refused to cooperate. Every attempt felt useless, like an invisible force was holding him there, forcing him to face the horror outside. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, as if something unseen had invaded the space and filled it with an unbearable weight. Lucas swallowed hard, his body trembling uncontrollably, but his eyes remained locked on the distorted figure, now closer, almost touching the glass. He could see its long, thin fingers, unnaturally stretched, tapping against the window with dry, hollow thuds, as though testing the boundaries of his reality. The creature, or whatever it was, didn't seem to care that Lucas had seen it. It was as if this was all part of an inevitable cycle, a script he was simply acting out without understanding. And that message, that simple warning to stay away from the windows, now made perfect sense. But it was too late. Suddenly, the air conditioner shut off, plunging the room into absolute silence. The light bulb flickered, as if on the verge of burning out. The room seemed to pulse, like it was bending under the weight of that entity's presence. Lucas felt an intense chill, a shiver that coursed through him from head to toe, and his thoughts were becoming jumbled. He tried to scream, but his throat was locked tight, his voice trapped. Nothing came out, and then, just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, the walls started to close in, subtly at first, as if the house itself was being crushed by some external force. The sensation was unbearable, as though the very space around him was collapsing. He tried to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor, like he was sinking into reality itself. That's when another window, in a distant room, burst open with a deafening crash. Lucas turned, his eyes immediately locking onto it. It wasn't just his bedroom window being invaded now. Every window in the house was opening one by one, as though an unseen force was orchestrating it all. He could no longer ignore it, no longer run from it. The suffocating feeling of being watched, of being consumed by something far beyond the physical, overwhelmed his mind. And then the worst happened. The sounds coming from the windows weren't just knocks or scratches anymore. It was a voice. Not a single voice, but a chorus. An eerie blend of echoes and whispers, coming from every corner of the room. "We saw you. Now, you'll see what we saw." Lucas felt his mind unravel. The pressure grew. His breathing became erratic, and panic gripped his entire body. He no longer knew what was real. The presence had seeped into everything, space, time, the very laws of physics. He was no longer in his home. He was somewhere twisted, where the rules didn't apply, where the line between the visible and the unseen had vanished. The creature outside, now fully visible, stared at him with eyes that gleamed unnervingly. It began to move erratically, every motion jarring and wrong. There was no trace of humanity left in it. Its limbs stretched and twisted unnaturally, as if its body was tearing apart to reveal something even more monstrous. It hovered at the edge of the window, and Lucas knew it was calling him. The feeling of being pulled out of reality was overwhelming. An invisible force gripped him, dragging him toward the window, towards something beyond his understanding. There was no doubt anymore. He knew what had to happen. The message hadn't just been a warning. It was a desperate plea, a final effort to save him. But it was too late. The window was open now, not just physically, but in a much deeper, more terrifying sense. Something was waiting for him out there, and it was pulling him in, leaving no room for resistance. The voice whispered again, directly into his mind. "You looked. Now come." And at the very moment Lucas felt the cold, heavy air fill his lungs, the entire room went dark. Lucas had no idea what awaited him, but he knew he'd already crossed the point of no return. The invisible force compelling him to stare at the windows had grown unbearable, trapping him in its grip. His eyes were locked in place, unable to look away from the shadowy figures outside, moving in a sinister, almost hypnotic dance. Each open window wasn't just letting in air. It was inviting something far darker, an abyss threatening to consume everything. The first window, the one closest to him, no longer looked like a simple pane of glass. It had transformed into a doorway to somewhere else. The cracked glass reflected a dull, shifting light, as if the world beyond it was constantly in flux. Lucas couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. Not anymore. The scene before him wasn't a typical outside view, but a distorted, chaotic expanse where the rules of physics no longer applied. It felt staged, as though designed to disorient him, and the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. Then, Lucas noticed something unsettling. A chill swept through his body, followed by a sudden wave of dizziness. It was as if the air itself had changed, thick and oppressive. The world around him began to warp. The house, once solid and familiar, now seemed to ripple, stretching and compressing like a living, breathing thing. The walls bent and twisted, turning translucent in spots, revealing the void outside, a dark, infinite nothingness that made his stomach churn. And then he realized he wasn't alone anymore. The shadowy figures that had been outside were now inside the house, occupying impossible spaces. They didn't walk. They floated, their misshapen, indistinct forms hovering eerily in the air. The most horrifying part was the way they moved. Not physically, but as if they were bending space itself, shifting in ways that defied all logic. The creature he had seen through the window was now directly in front of him, but it had changed into something even more terrifying. It no longer resembled a distorted figure. It had become a physical manifestation of Lucas's deepest fears. Its body twisted and stretched, constantly shifting between forms, its limbs elongating and shrinking erratically. Its face morphed between expressions of agony and a chilling, almost euphoric grin. But its appearance wasn't the worst part. The true horror was the way it communicated. Not with words, but with a crushing, unspoken pressure on Lucas's mind. The creature wasn't speaking aloud, yet Lucas understood, with horrifying clarity, that it was trying to show him something. Something he desperately didn't want to see. "You shouldn't have looked." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was sharp, unrelenting, and it echoed inside his head with terrifying clarity. He felt his blood turn to ice as the reality around him started to unravel. He tried to shut his eyes, to block it all out, but his vision was no longer under his control. He was being forced to look, forced to see everything. The house began collapsing around him, not in the way a physical structure crumbles, but as though its very essence was being stripped away. Layer by layer, it dissolved, leaving nothing but emptiness. It felt as though Lucas himself was being erased, removed from existence. He couldn't feel the floor beneath him anymore. He couldn't sense the dampness of the air or the warmth of his breath. All that remained was a void, filled with the presence of these creatures. These entities he couldn't begin to understand. But the emptiness wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that something even older, something far deeper, was waking up. A darkness that couldn't be seen, but could be felt. A presence beyond the windows, beyond the house. The creature spoke again, this time with a voice that seemed to echo from all directions. "They're coming. They already know you looked." Lucas felt his legs weaken, terror flooding every cell in his body. The creature before him took a step forward, but it wasn't a physical step. It was a movement in space, a manipulation of time, as if it were crossing layers of reality just to get closer to him. He tried to run, but his vision began to blur. The space around him disintegrated completely, as if he were a part of a distorted nightmare. In a final attempt to escape, Lucas squeezed his eyes shut, desperately trying to ignore the sensation of being pulled out of his own body. But it didn't work. He could still see everything around him, as if he were in a state of half-consciousness. The windows kept opening one by one, releasing what was behind them. He could no longer tell what was real and what was part of what he was being forced to witness. The creatures were now in every corner of the house, their shadows taking shape, their distorted figures slowly becoming more defined. They were no longer distant figures. They were right there, beside him, and he knew that somewhere, beyond the windows, something even more terrifying was watching them. Something that shouldn't be seen. Something that was now coming after him. You looked. Now! You'll be part of it. And in that last moment, Lucas was swallowed by the darkness. When Lucas woke up, the silence was suffocating. He didn't know how much time had passed since that fateful moment, but the emptiness around him seemed to be consuming any trace of reality. The floor was cold, the dampness in the room relentless, but the strangest thing was that everything seemed normal. There were no distorted creatures hovering in the air, no more feeling of being watched. Everything was quiet, but that silence didn't bring relief. It brought anguish. He slowly stood up, feeling an invisible weight on his shoulders. The house around him was intact, but it felt like something was missing. He didn't know what, but the emptiness was so intense it made his stomach churn. There was something in every corner that felt incomplete. And then he looked at the windows. The windows were there, still broken in some places, but there were no more distortions, no floating figures outside. Everything seemed to be in its normal state. However, there was something strange in the air. He couldn't see clearly, but something moved, like a fleeting shadow in the distance. There was no sound, but the feeling that something was approaching, like an omen, made his skin crawl. Lucas took a hesitant step toward one of the windows, his breath growing heavier. He knew he should step back, that he should ignore the impulse to look, but something called to him. He couldn't resist. Something inside him, maybe a leftover curiosity or desperation, urged him closer, even though he knew it was a fatal mistake. When his eyes finally fixed on what was outside, the feeling of anguish intensified. It was as if the glass was no longer an obstacle. He felt as though he was crossing an invisible layer, a barrier between the real world and something much darker. The reality around him started to bend again, but now, instead of distortion, there was a feeling of closeness, as if something was slowly infiltrating his world, and he could no longer escape. The figures he had seen before were no longer there, but in their place, the emptiness outside the window seemed to be breathing, as if the world beyond his house was alive. There was something waiting. Lucas was overwhelmed by a sense of terror that froze his bones. The window glass now seemed like a portal, not a barrier. He could no longer distinguish where the glass ended and what lay beyond it began. What was on the other side was no longer a distant landscape. It was an extension of the very nightmare he had been trying to leave behind. The shadow moving wasn't a figure, but a pure presence, malleable, as if it was expanding to swallow the house, swallow his very existence. And then he heard it, not a voice, but a whisper, a sound infiltrating his mind, as if it were being transmitted directly into his brain. It wasn't clear communication, but a distorted sensation, a broken intuition, something he knew in his soul without needing to fully understand. You can't escape. You're already inside. The window glass distorted, as if responding to the presence on the other side. Lucas tried to pull away, but his feet were stuck, as if the ground had glued itself to his shoes. He looked around, searching for any way to escape, but the house now didn't seem like a familiar place anymore. The walls were damp, pulsing as if they were alive. The air was thick, charged with strange energy. Suddenly, a force yanked him back toward the window, pulling him closer again, forcing him to look beyond the glass. Something was now visible. A figure emerged from the shadows, not in the shape of a human being, but with a presence so overwhelming that Lucas felt his mind try to shut down before it. The figure was distorted, undefinable, but still he knew, with indescribable fear, that this was what was behind those windows, what had always been there waiting. The glass trembled, the window twisted, and a sensation of darkness engulfed everything. The figure was no longer outside. It was inside, and Lucas felt his legs fail as reality around him shattered, transforming into an endless abyss. He was no longer in the house. He was somewhere else, a place where rules didn't exist, where time had ceased to move. He was inside the window, within that which had never been looked at. He screamed, but there was no sound. The presence drew nearer, its touch cold as death. And Lucas' last thought before being swallowed by the darkness was that he should have never looked, never should have crossed the threshold of the window. When Lucas awoke, it wasn't as if he had simply woken from a nightmare. Reality wasn't the same. The air was dense, unshakable, as if time had stopped for him, trapping him in an eternal moment. The house was empty, but the walls seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing. The sound was absent, but not the emptiness. The emptiness was saturated with something far heavier. He was back, but not in the way he should have been. Every part of his body felt the weight of the experience, but his mind was fragmented, a web of thoughts crossing and disconnecting like broken wires. He didn't know how much time had passed since that moment at the window. The only sign that he was still alive was the unsettling feeling that he shouldn't be here, that he had already gone, already crossed the line. But he was back, or perhaps he had never left. He looked around. Everything was exactly as before. The house, the broken windows, the deep silence enveloping him. But the sense that something was about to happen, something even more horrifying, gnawed at him from within. He turned to the windows, hesitating, the memory of what he had seen outside, and more importantly, what had happened inside his own mind, returning with haunting clarity. His reflection in the window was distorted, but now he couldn't afford to think it was just a disturbing vision. He knew that this wasn't merely a distortion of reality. It wasn't just an illusion. He was inside the window in a way that couldn't be explained, as if he had merged with the very essence of what lay beyond it. The voice returned, not a whisper now, but a deep echo, reverberating not in his ears but inside his body, within his bones. He felt the sound as an internal pressure, each word piercing his soul. You can't escape. You're already here. He tried to move, but his feet were glued to the ground. The window before him no longer seemed like a physical object, but a sort of gate, a threshold between reality and whatever came after. And once again, he felt the presence drawing closer, like unbearable pressure, an invisible force pushing him against the window. He could no longer distinguish where the house began and where the broken reality on the other side started. The glass was now against his skin, becoming an extension of his own flesh. He didn't know how, but he knew that what was beyond the window was no longer separate from him. It was consuming him, not physically, but in his soul, in his mind. Every breath became harder, every beat of his heart heavier. He was no longer himself. He had been absorbed, torn apart, transformed into something that no longer had a name. And then the glass trembled again. This time it wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a distant figure. There was no longer a sense of distance between him and what was outside. The presence was right in front of him, inside of him, a shape he couldn't comprehend, but one that felt deeply familiar, something he recognized without understanding why, as if he'd seen it before, somewhere far away or too close, maybe even in his own mind. He shut his eyes, but there was no escape now. The sound came back, but not as an echo. This time, it was a deafening roar, filling his mind with an endless scream, an outcry from something he should never have allowed to exist inside him. And when he finally opened his eyes, there was no house anymore. There was nothing but the window. He was inside it now, and what lay beyond was no longer a reflection of what he knew. He was lost in a place where reality no longer made sense, where the echoes of his past choices had become the only truth. The glass shattered, but there was no fall, no sound. There was only an abyss, a deep, absolute emptiness. He couldn't escape anymore. He should never have looked. Now, he was part of what lay beyond the window. He was the echo of what had already been. Lucas no longer knew who he was. Time seemed to stretch and fragment around him, each second becoming an unchanging echo. The emptiness around him was absolute, as if there was no more room for what remained of him. He could no longer distinguish between the sounds coming from his own mind and those coming from beyond the window. His own breath seemed to be guided by something invisible, something he couldn't control, but that was starting to become part of him. The environment, if it could even be called that, was a heavy, endless fog. The ground was no longer solid, nor was the air breathable. The window, once just a barrier between two worlds, was now the only point of anchor. But what did it represent? What was that space? He didn't know, and maybe that was the scariest part. Something began to move within the fog. Slowly, a shape began to materialize, distorting as it took form. It was a figure, but not of flesh and bone. It was more like a dark outline, an emptiness within an emptiness. Lucas couldn't look away. He knew that if he did, something far worse would happen. The feeling that he had done something terrible by looking outside the window was overtaking every fiber of his being. The figure stopped in front of him, just a few meters away. It was silent, but Lucas could feel its weight, like an immense, crushing presence. The space around them seemed to start warping, what he understood as reality fading away. He was floating in a sea of disjointed images and muffled sounds, but the creature's eyes were locked on him. He could no longer move. He didn't want to. He felt that if he did, whatever that thing was, it would take him somewhere beyond understanding. It was the end of a cycle, a line he could no longer cross. And he knew with a terrible certainty that if he made any move, his soul would be torn apart. The figure moved closer, the contours of its body seeming to warp even more, as if reality itself was trying to twist and escape from its form. A hand, if it could even be called that, reached out for him, and the moment stretched on for an eternity. Lucas felt the pressure of something like mentally slippery tendrils tightening around his mind. It was a pain that couldn't be explained, a feeling of being undone from the inside out. But before he could succumb completely, a sudden memory flashed through his mind. He remembered what his mother always used to say when he was a child. Never look outside when the lights go out. What you see is no longer in your world. It's in your worst nightmare. He had failed. He had looked. And now, there was no turning back. The thing started to speak, but not with words. It was an implicit message, more of a deep whisper running through Lucas's veins. He could feel it invade his mind, taking control of his body. He was no longer a person. There was no more Lucas. What remained of him now was nothing but a reflection of what lay beyond the window, the thing he should never have seen. The cycle had started again, and he knew what that meant. When the figure pulled away, Lucas felt an absolute coldness run down his spine. It was the deepest, most terrifying silence he had ever felt. He looked behind him, and that was when he realized the truth. He was back in the house, but the house was no longer the same. Now, the windows were closed, and inside them, Lucas's reflection was no longer his face. It was the same figure he had seen from the outside. The cycle was about to begin again,